Here's a question that should keep you up at night. What happens when you give a corporation an army? Not a security team, not private contractors, an actual army with artillery and warships, and the authority to declare war, sign treaties, and collect taxes from millions of people. You're probably thinking this is a hypothetical, some dystopian thought experiment about Amazon or Google gone rogue. It's not. This already happened, and it reshaped the modern world. Between 1600 and 1858, a trading company headquartered on Leadenhall Street in London grew from a handful of merchants with 3 ships into the most powerful corporation in human history. At its peak, it governed a fifth of humanity. It had twice the military power of the nation that chartered it. It triggered famines, started wars, overthrew governments, and pioneered the drug trade on an industrial scale. And it did all of this not for king and country, but for shareholders and profit margins. This is the story of the Honorable East India Company. And if you think it's just history, you haven't been paying attention to the world around you. December 31st, 1600. While most of England is doing whatever Elizabethans did for New Year's Eve, probably something involving mead and lutes, Queen Elizabeth I is in her palace signing what might be the most consequential business contract in history. The document grants a charter to 218 merchants and adventurers who've pooled their resources into a venture called the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. Try fitting that on a business card. History will mercifully shorten it to the East India Company, or EIC. What does this charter give them? A 15-year monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. In other words, everything from South Africa to South America, going the long way around. The entire Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, and the Far East. All yours, gentlemen. Make us rich. But there's a problem. The Portuguese and Spanish have been running this game for a century. They've got forts, fleets, and a papal decree literally dividing the world between them. The Dutch, fresh off telling Spain where to stick it, have just formed their own super company, the VOC, and they're vicious about it. The French are sniffing around too. The English are late to the party, underfunded, and operating in waters controlled by people who really don't want them there. Perfect conditions for making terrible decisions that somehow work out. August 24th, 1608. After months at sea, a ship called the Hector drops anchor at Surat on India's western coast. The captain, William Hawkins, whose job description is essentially convince the most powerful emperor in the world to let a bunch of strangers set up shop in his empire. No pressure. The Mughal Empire in 628 is not some declining power ripe for exploitation. Emperor Jahangir rules over 100 million people, commands vast wealth, and presides over a court that makes European royalty look like provincial mayors. The Mughals have superior metallurgy, textile production that won't be matched in Europe for another century, and an administrative system that actually works. Hawkins needs to navigate Mughal court politics, dodge Portuguese assassins, they're really not happy about English competition, and somehow convince Jahangir that doing business with these scruffy island merchants is worth his time. It takes years. The Portuguese lobby hard against him. Court intrigues nearly get him killed. But Hawkins is persistent, and Jahangir is curious about counterbalancing Portuguese influence. By 1612, the emperor grants permission for the English to establish a factory at Surat. Again, factory means fortified trading post, not manufacturing. It's part warehouse, part diplomatic mission, part military installation. The English agents live there, store goods, negotiate with local merchants, and pray the Mughals don't change their minds. It works. Once Surat is established, the playbook becomes clear: show up, negotiate permission, build a factory, start trading. Over the next few decades, the pattern repeats up and down the Indian coast. 1639, Madras. The company leases land from a local ruler and builds Fort St. George. It's supposed to be a trading post. Within years, it's becoming a city. King Charles II gets Bombay as part of his dowry when he marries Catherine of Braganza. He immediately leases it to the East India Company for £10 a year, absolute steal. The company fortifies it and turns it into their western headquarters. 1690s, Calcutta. The company establishes Fort William on the Hooghly River in Bengal. This will matter a lot. Here's what the company is doing right. They're not conquering, they're trading. They buy Indian textiles, cotton, silk, indigo, and ship them back to Europe where the profit margins are insane. They also trade within Asia, moving goods between India, Southeast Asia, and China. They're making money, building relationships, and keeping their heads down. They're merchants, operating in someone else's empire, playing by someone else's rules, for now. The EIC isn't alone in this game. The Dutch VOC is richer, more ruthless, and better organized. In the Spice Islands of modern Indonesia, the VOC doesn't just trade. They conquer, enslave, and massacre anyone who threatens their nutmeg monopoly. In 1621, they execute 10 English merchants in Amboina for allegedly plotting against them. The English get the message: stay out of Southeast Asia or things get messy, so the company pivots. If the Dutch own the Spice Islands, fine. The EIC will focus on India and the China trade. Different markets, different strategies. The French are also circling. They establish their own East India Company in 1664 and start building their own factory network in India. For the next century, English and French trading companies will fight proxy wars across India, using local alliances and sepoy armies. Wait, armies for a trading company? Yeah, we're getting there. By the mid-1600s, the EIC is profitable but precarious. The Mughal Empire still calls the shots. Local rulers can revoke permissions. Pirates raid shipping. Competitors undercut prices. The company is constantly broke, constantly lobbying Parliament for favorable terms, constantly one bad monsoon season away from collapse. But they're also learning Indian languages, learning local politics, learning which Mughal officials take bribes and which ones don't, learning that sometimes a well-armed ship and a show of force gets better trade terms than polite negotiation. They're also hiring. The company needs soldiers to protect factories, ships, and trade routes. At first, these are European mercenaries. But Europeans die of tropical disease at appalling rates. Solution: hire locally. Indian soldiers called sepoys led by British officers. Cheaper, more resistant to local diseases, and they know the terrain. The EIC starts building a private military. In 1650, nobody thinks this will lead anywhere significant. The company has maybe a few thousand soldiers scattered across India. The Mughal Empire has hundreds of thousands. The power balance is obvious, but empires don't last forever, and the Mughals are about to learn that the hard way. Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb dies after a 49-year reign. He's expanded the empire to its greatest extent, but he's also bankrupted it fighting endless wars in the Deccan. His successors are weak. The provinces start acting independently. Governors become kings in all but name. The Mughal Empire doesn't collapse overnight, it fragments. And in those fragments, opportunity appears. For the EIC, this is a problem and a solution. Problem: their trade agreements were with the central Mughal authority, which is now barely functional. Solution: they can now negotiate directly with regional powers, play them against each other, and extract better terms. But they're not the only ones thinking this way. The French are doing the same thing. For the next 50 years, the EIC and the French Compagnie des Indes fight a series of proxy wars across southern India. They back rival local rulers, hire sepoy armies, and occasionally just fight each other directly. Enter Robert Clive, the man who broke India. Robert Clive arrives in India in 1744 as a low-level company clerk. He's 19, depressed, and by his own admission has already tried to shoot himself twice. The pistol misfired both times. Not the most promising start. But Clive discovers he's good at war, really good. When fighting breaks out between the English and French in southern India, Clive volunteers for military service. He helps capture the fortress of Arcot with a tiny force, holds it against overwhelming odds, and becomes a company hero. By the 1750s, Clive is a major player, and his attention turns north to Bengal. Bengal is the richest province in India. Fertile land, huge population, massive tax base. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, is young and paranoid. He suspects correctly that the European companies are becoming too powerful. In 1756, he captures Calcutta. The EIC wants it back. They send Clive with an army. Plassey, the battle that wasn't. June 23, 1757. The Battle of Plassey. On paper, this should be a slaughter. Siraj-ud-Daulah has around 50,000 troops, cavalry, and artillery. Robert Clive has about 3,000 soldiers, mostly sepoys with European officers. The math doesn't work. Except Clive has made a deal, a secret deal, with Mir Jafar, Siraj's military commander. The arrangement is simple. Mir Jafar doesn't fight. In exchange, the EIC puts him on the throne and pays him handsomely. How handsomely? The exact amounts are disputed. Some records were conveniently lost, though we're talking massive bribes in gold and silver. So when the battle starts, most of Siraj's army just stands there. Mir Jafar's forces don't engage. The Nawab's position collapses. He flees, gets captured, and is executed. Mir Jafar becomes the new Nawab, and Robert Clive becomes one of the richest men in Britain. Historians still debate Plassey. Was it a brilliant military victory, or just successful corruption on a massive scale? The answer is probably both. Clive had the tactical skill to exploit the situation, but the battle was won with gold before a shot was fired. Here's what's not debatable. Plassey changes everything. The Diwani, when traders became tax collectors after Plassey, the company doesn't officially rule Bengal. They've just installed a puppet Nawab. They're still technically merchants operating under Mughal authority, but in 1765, that fiction dies. Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, desperate for allies and money, grants the East India Company the Diwani rights over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This is the right to collect taxes, administer justice, and control revenue for a territory with tens of millions of people. Let me repeat that. A trading company now has the legal authority to tax, govern, and control the finances of one of the richest regions in Asia. Robert Clive describes the situation with stunning clarity. We are sensible that, since the acquisition of the Duany, the power formerly belonging to the Suba of those provinces is totally vested in the East India Company. Nothing remains to him but the name and shadow of authority. The Mughal emperor is a figurehead. The Nawab is a puppet. The East India Company is the government, and they're terrible at it. The army grows. To enforce this new arrangement and protect their expanding territory, the EIC massively expands its military. By the early 1800s, they're fielding an army of up to 260,000 sepoys with European officers. That's larger than the British Army itself. Think about that. A private company has a standing military larger than the armed forces of the nation that chartered it. They use this army to expand further. Wars against Mysore. Wars against the Marathas. Wars against the Sikhs. One by one, the independent powers of India are either conquered, absorbed, or forced into treaties that amount to vassalage. The company is no longer a trading concern that occasionally fights. It's a military power that occasionally trades. The famine Bengal. The monsoons fail. Crops die. Famine spreads. Contemporary accounts describe corpses piling up in the streets of Calcutta, villages emptying out, survivors selling their children for food. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of Bengal's population dies. We're talking about 10 million people. The East India Company's role in this catastrophe is still debated. Was it natural disaster or economic policy? The truth is complicated. The drought was real. But so was the company's relentless extraction of tax revenue, even as the famine raged. They needed the money to fund their wars and pay dividends to shareholders back in London. Historian William Dalrymple, analyzing company budgetary records, has called the wealth transfer out of India under EIC rule the largest until the Nazi looting of Europe. That's not exaggeration, that's math. The 1770 famine is a warning sign. The company has power, but not competence. They're extraction machines without governance capacity. They take, and when crisis comes, they don't know how to respond except by taking more. It gets worse. Here's how to make obscene profits in the early 1800s. Step 1. Use your monopoly power in India to force farmers to grow opium instead of food. Step 2. Ship the opium to China. Step 3. When the Chinese government tries to stop you from poisoning their population, start a war to force the market open. Step 4. Profit. This isn't a simplification, this is literally what happened. The EIC discovers that opium grown in Bengal sells for huge margins in China. Never mind that opium addiction is destroying Chinese society. Never mind that the Chinese emperor has banned the trade. The company needs revenue, and opium provides it. When China cracks down, seizing and destroying opium shipments in 1839, the British government, with heavy company lobbying, goes to war. Twice. The Opium Wars forced China to accept the drug trade and cede Hong Kong to Britain. Free trade, enforced at gunpoint and backed by drug money. The perfect capitalist venture. Back in India, the company is rotting from within. Company officials are supposed to be salaried employees. In practice, they're running private trading operations on the side, taking bribes, embezzling tax revenue, and treating their positions as licenses to loot. The line between company interest and personal enrichment has completely dissolved. Robert Clive himself, when questioned by Parliament about his wealth, famously said he was astonished at his own moderation for not taking more. This is the hero of Plassey admitting to massive corruption and acting like he deserves credit for restraint. The East India Company's London headquarters knows this is happening. They just don't care enough to stop it as long as dividends keep flowing. But back in Britain, the government is getting nervous. A private corporation now controls more territory than the crown. It has its own army, its own foreign policy, and its own revenue system. It's essentially a parallel state. Parliament starts passing regulatory acts, trying to impose oversight. The company fights back, lobbying furiously to maintain its independence. It's a slow-motion power struggle between corporate and governmental authority. Then, 1857 happens. It starts with a rumor. The new Enfield rifle requires soldiers to bite open paper cartridges to load. Word spreads that these cartridges are greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindu sepoys, cows are sacred. For Muslim sepoys, pigs are forbidden. Biting the cartridge would violate fundamental religious principles. Is the rumor true? Maybe. Maybe not. Some historians think it was deliberate provocation. Others think it was careless oversight. Either way, it's the spark that lights decades of accumulated grievance. May 10, 1857. Meerut. Sepoys mutiny, kill their British officers, and march on Delhi. The rebellion spreads like wildfire. Entire regiments defect. Cities rise up. For a moment, it looks like British rule in India might actually collapse. What's happening depends entirely on who you ask. The British call it the Sepoy Mutiny, a military revolt by disloyal soldiers. Indian nationalists call it the First War of Independence, a coordinated uprising against colonial oppression. Modern historians call it complicated because it was. Some sepoys were fighting for their rights. Some were fighting for old aristocratic rulers. Some were fighting because their commanders were incompetent racist tyrants. Some regions stayed completely quiet. Others exploded in violence. The British response is brutal. They retake Delhi after months of fighting. They execute rebels by the thousands. In some cases, they tie prisoners to cannons and blow them apart as a demonstration. By 1858, the rebellion is crushed. But the damage to the company's reputation is irreparable. The British Parliament passes the Government of India Act. The East India Company is dissolved. All territories, all powers, all authority transfers to the British Crown. The Governor-General becomes the Viceroy. The company's army becomes the British Indian Army. The Mughal Emperor, still technically alive in Delhi, is exiled. The age of the company is over. The British Raj begins. The EIC limps along in zombie form for another 16 years, handling administrative loose ends. In 1874, it's formally liquidated. The most powerful corporation in history ceases to exist. The corporate ghost. So what was the East India Company? It started as merchants chasing spices. It became a military power, then a government, then an empire administered by shareholders and profit margins instead of kings and constitutions. At its peak, it controlled the Indian subcontinent not through royal conquest, but through corporate charter. It raised armies, collected taxes, negotiated treaties, and governed territory. It did all of this nominally in service of trade, but really in service of shareholder returns and executive enrichment. The physical legacy is everywhere. Fort St. George in Chennai, Fort William in Kolkata. The administrative systems, the railways, the legal frameworks. These outlasted the company by centuries and still shape modern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The documentary evidence survives too. The British Library holds over 350 years of company records. Charters, correspondence, budgetary accounts, military dispatches. You can trace the entire arc from trading post to empire in their archives. The minutes of board meetings where they debated how much to pay Mir Jafar to betray his emperor. The tax collection figures as Bengal starved. The opium export ledgers. It's all there. They wrote everything down. The debates continue today. How much of India's economic decline was company policy versus existing Mughal collapse? Were they civilizers bringing railways and administration, or extractors causing famines and deindustrialization? Did they conquer India, or just occupy the space left by Mughal fragmentation? The evidence is complicated. The wealth transfer was very real. Modern historians like William Dalrymple have documented how the company drained resources from one of the world's richest economies and redirected that wealth to Britain. The Indian textile industry, which once dominated global markets, was systematically destroyed to protect British manufacturers. The tax system that funded Mughal grandeur was redirected to fund company dividends and British wars. This wasn't development. This was extraction with paperwork. The warning. Here's why the East India Company story matters today, because we're still asking the same questions. What happens when corporations get too powerful? When profit motive overrides governance responsibility? When private entities wield public authority? The EIC had monopoly rights, tax authority, a private army, diplomatic recognition, the ability to make war and peace. They started as merchants and ended as emperors, and every step of that transformation was technically legal because they had the right charters and the right connections. Today we worry about tech companies that control information flow and shape public discourse. We worry about corporations that dodge taxes and capture regulators. We worry about private military contractors operating in war zones. We worry about companies that are too big to fail and therefore operate under different rules than everyone else. The East India Company did all of this first, and when people warned about the dangers, they were told not to worry. The company is just pursuing profit. The market will regulate itself. Interference would be anti-business. Then came the famines, the wars, the drug trade, the corruption, the collapse, the reckoning. The bill came due, eventually. It always does. But here's the thing about the East India Company. When it finally failed, the people who suffered most weren't the shareholders or the executives. They got bailed out. The company's debts were assumed by the British government, which meant British taxpayers. The company's territories became crown territories, which meant expanded empire. The people who paid the price were the millions who died in famines, the sepoys who were executed for rebellion, the Indian economy that was systematically dismantled, and the generations who inherited a colonial system built on corporate foundations. The East India Company didn't just change history, It revealed something fundamental about what happens when you combine profit motive with governmental power and remove accountability. Some corporations sell products, some change industries. The East India Company changed continents, reshaped global economics, and pioneered a form of corporate colonialism that we're still dealing with today. Not bad for a company that started with a New Year's Eve charter and dreams of pepper. The question isn't whether something like the East India Company could happen again. The question is, what are we already allowing to happen that future generations will look back on with the same horror? That's the ghost the company left behind. And it's not done haunting us yet.